Our world is very good at being divided at the moment. You've probably noticed that. It seems like opinions are held more strongly than ever before, whether it's political convictions or perhaps even perspectives on how we respond to the pandemic. It seems that in every realm at the moment there are sides who are very good at voicing their own opinions and at vilifying the opposite side. Now, division is sometimes inevitable. It often comes down to whether the perspective we hold is held strongly and has a significant impact. If two strong opinions with such significant impact come into contact with each other, then there will often be unavoidable division. Imagine, for example, one person from Cwmbran being sent off to university. She likes to play sport and keep fit, but her roommate, who comes from another part of the country, happens to be someone who is rather unhealthy and very lazy. Now, they're two very different outlooks on life, but there's no essential reason why they can't live together. The consequence of those different perspectives is not that significant. But imagine another person being sent off to university from Cwmbran. He is a vegan. He never touches any animal products whatsoever. But his roommate is someone who was raised in a tribe of cannibals. And he remains completely committed to cannibalism. Now, in that scenario, division is not only likely, it's probably essential in order to save the life of the vegan. Now, we can agree to disagree over things that we either don't hold so strongly or over things that don't have such significant consequences. But when that's not the case, sometimes division of one kind or another is necessary. Now, Christians are not to be divisive people. Paul, who we're reading about here, he said elsewhere that if it is possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with other people. So Christians should have a high level of tolerance so that we can live at peace with other people. And yet at the same time, the Christian message is divisive. The message of Jesus causes division. Following Jesus and living a distinct Christian life will cause division. Telling people about Jesus will cause division. We shouldn't be trying to stir up division deliberately as if that were our goal, but because of the strength with which we hold our message and the significance of what we believe, it may cause other people to divide and separate from us. So let's dive into the story here and see how it happens in this instance. Having left Pisidian Antioch because they were thrown out of the city, Paul and Barnabas now travel on to a town called Iconium, which is now called Konya in modern day Turkey. And they do their usual practice there. They go into the local synagogue and it seems that they're given a very similar chance to speak as they were given before in the synagogue context. So verse 1 tells us that their preaching once again is powerful and effective, because a lot of people believe, both Jews and Greeks, people from the synagogue and people outside of the synagogue. But here's the first sign of division, because in the very next verse, in verse 2, we see, "But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers." So there's an immediate division over belief. Those who believe the message of Paul and Barnabas and those who don't. Those who accept the good news that Jesus has died and risen to set us straight with God, and those who refuse to believe that message. Those who do refuse, well, they begin to stir things up with others, with those who aren't Jews in the city. In fact, Luke gives us some very evocative description there. He says that they poison the minds of the Gentiles. They've got in there and contaminated their thinking so that they won't accept what has been said about Paul, said by Paul and Barnabas. Here's the thing, whether we will believe in Jesus or not, that is a dividing line that runs through the whole of humanity. There is no middle ground. There's no neutral position. Once a person has heard the message of Jesus, they either believe it or they don't. For someone who is not yet sure, someone who is making up their mind and investigating what Jesus has said, that's great, that's wonderful. But that's not yet in the position of belief. Perhaps you've been watching along with our online worship and taking it all in, considering it carefully. But if you've yet to decide that you do believe and that you will follow Jesus, then you're not yet on the side of one who believes. Now, in the future, when Jesus returns to this earth, there will be a dividing of all humanity along the lines of belief. For those who have believed in him in this current age and lifetime, we will be welcomed into eternal life, of being with Jesus forever. But for those who remain in a position of unbelief in this age and in this lifetime, there will be such a division where they're not welcomed into God's eternal home, but instead they receive the inevitable consequences for all that we have done wrong, experiencing God's wrath and his judgment. Now that division will happen in the future when Jesus returns, and when that happens, that is a division that happens forever. It lasts forever. And that means that it's vitally important that we realize which side we are on now, and that we put ourselves in a position of someone who believes in Jesus now. There is no neutral ground. We must believe in Jesus. And that can be today. Today you can believe in Jesus. Today you can accept that he gave his life so that you could be made alive in him, so that you could be brought into a new relationship with God. If you will accept that Jesus endured the consequences for your sins so that you don't have to, if you believe in him enough to give your whole life over to him, that will put you on the side of one who believes. Well, what are Paul and Barnabas going to do? They've experienced some opposition. Their opponents are now poisoning the minds of others. They might feel like giving up in the face of such opposition, but they don't. And what's more, they don't just give it another quick go. Have a look at what it says about them in verse 3. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord. And so for a considerable time, not just a short time, for a long time, they stick around. Even though people are working against what they are doing, they stick around. Now, when we're involved in gospel work, we're in a deep spiritual battle, and the devil may use various means of opposing the effective outreach of God's people. And sometimes it can even come in the most surprising of ways. The question for us when we face this kind of opposition is, will we stick it out? Will we commit and not give up in the first instance? There is a time for sticking around in opposition, for digging in your heels and just carrying on the work that you're doing in a certain place with certain people. Perhaps you begin to tell someone about your faith, a close friend or a family member, and they immediately shut you down. They say that they don't want to hear any of that. But there is a time to keep on going with them as a close friend, to love them and care for them and show the love of Christ to them, and to not be afraid to bring up your faith with them again. Maybe the scenario is that you've been running some sort of outreach ministry in the church, but you've noticed that when it comes to the talk or the study that you do to share the message of Jesus, those who are coming along, they just don't listen. They're either too easily distracted in that moment, or they're stubbornly refusing to engage. Now, of course, we may need to stop and take stock of how we're delivering the message. That might be appropriate to look at. But there's a time for keeping on going. There's a time to keep on putting in the hard work of preparing those talks and studies and giving them, even though people's attention spans wane. There are times for digging in, stubbornly sticking it out in the midst of opposition and keeping on sharing the gospel. But then what happens in the story is that Jesus does his work. Now, if you read the first few verses in the book of Acts, it says how in his first book, Luke's gospel account, he wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. Now, the implication of that is that the book of Acts is all about what Jesus continues to do and teach as the risen and ascended Lord of the universe. Now, with that in mind, have a look at the detail in verse 3, the second half of verse 3. Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. So as Paul and Barnabas speak about Jesus, so Jesus confirms what they are saying by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. Now, we're in the dark as to what those miracles are, and we see one in the next city, which we'll come on to next week. We can only imagine that the signs and wonders Jesus does through Paul and Barnabas here are similar to the signs and wonders that Jesus does in the gospel accounts when he was here on this earth. Now, some people believe that miracles, at least of this kind, have ceased. The reason being that signs and wonders, they were associated with the apostles. And since the apostles are no more, so they say these kinds of miracles are no more. Now, I disagree with that. For one, the way I see it, the miracles were not there just to confirm the authenticity of the apostles, but to confirm the continuation of Jesus' work in this world, and to confirm the authenticity of the gospel message, and to confirm the continuation of the arrival of the kingdom of God in this world. And since Jesus is still working in this world, since the gospel is still the same authentic message, since the kingdom is still here, I believe that miracles may still continue today. It's interesting that as the word apostle is used here, it includes Paul and Barnabas. And yet, as far as we know, Barnabas was not personally sent by Jesus to do his work. He is not, in that sense, an apostle of Christ, equal with the 12. So I don't think that Luke is using the word apostle here as an apostle of Christ. And therefore, he is not talking about their authenticity as apostles. That's not why the signs and wonders are here in this instance. As the verse actually says, this is about Jesus confirming their message through the miracles that they perform, not their role as apostles of the church. Now, miracles come about by the power of Jesus working through his Spirit who lives within the believer. But we may wonder why we don't see as many miracles in our context as was the case in the book of Acts. It's a valid question. It's a helpful question. But Jesus is a personal being. He's not an automated vending machine. And the same is true of the Spirit. He's not an invisible automatic force. He is a person. And so the working of miracles is not an automatic thing. We cannot presume that we will always see miracles whenever we want them. We can't even say if we have enough faith, then we are guaranteed to see a miracle. It's up to Jesus. It's up to the Spirit. It's entirely right to plead with Jesus to work miracles. There's every reason why he might give them in greater abundance in certain contexts, such as a pioneering gospel situation. It may be that it is necessary for a miracle to confirm the authenticity of the message. But that doesn't mean we should presume that we will never see miracles. It doesn't mean that we should never ask Jesus to work in the miraculous. Anyway, just to pull things back on track a little, the miracles here, they confirm the truthfulness of the message. And whether or not we see miracles, we see other evidences, other confirmations of the genuine gospel that we share, particularly as people's lives are changed, as people grow in holiness, as believers care for the poor and needy amongst them and in their society, as a church is pulled together in love and unity, as whole communities are sometimes transformed by the presence of a church within it. There are many evidences of the message of the gospel being authentic. And yet, even with such clear evidence of the reality of the message and its impact in people's lives, what happens? Some people accept the evidence, but some people reject it. Even with the strong evidence of the miraculous here in Acts 14, it still divides. Let's have a look at that in verses 3 and 4. So they were speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. So even with such powerful workings and miracles, well, you would have thought that people would have to believe the message. But it's not necessarily so. How many times have you heard someone today say that if God did a miracle for them right in front of them, then they would believe? And yet it's just not true. Even as signs and wonders are done in front of people through the power of Jesus, some people still do not believe. It's a hoax, they say. You got lucky. Maybe it's the work of the devil pretending to be God's power. People come up with any excuse not to believe in the message of Jesus if they are on that side. The divisions that already existed are actually made even more significant in the face of evidence. The evidences of changed lives, of unity and love in a church, of care for the needy. Even with these evidences, some will still divide and disbelieve the message of Jesus. Well, back in the story, there's a plot developing amongst those who have rejected the message. They are planning to throw stones at Paul and Barnabas, either to seriously harm them, or perhaps even to kill them. They're probably planning some sort of ambush, rather than this being the Jewish legal form of justice. But see what happens in verse 6. But they, Paul and Barnabas, found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country. Do you see there's a time to stick around and dig in and keep working hard, but here there's also a time to get out because of the risks involved. For Paul and Barnabas, they have tried digging in and carrying on, but now it's time for them to get out and to share the gospel in Lystra and Derbe. They need to hear about Jesus now. It's something that people who share the gospel overseas often face. Sometimes for people working overseas, it becomes dangerous to remain in a country when you're trying to share Jesus. Sometimes it's because of people who oppose the message, as it was with Paul and Barnabas. Sometimes it's just because of another conflict that's going on in the country or a medical situation that makes it dangerous to stay in the country. Now, it's a tough call because usually those who are the missionaries working in that country, they want to stay and to work hard. But sometimes it's right to leave because of the dangers involved. Now, there may come a time when that is more literally the case for our own context. But for other reasons, it may be sometimes appropriate to stop pushing things and to come out of a situation that we had been trying to share the gospel in. It's always a tough call, but sometimes it's right to stop. Not for fear of our own reputation, that shouldn't be our concern, but for where it is risky, or just where it's no longer doing any good and potentially doing a lot of harm to remain in a situation where we're trying to share the gospel. There is a time to get out and leave. How do you know when? Well, prayer should be our first port of call. But then the wisdom God has given us and the advice of others through the wisdom God has given them. That should help steer us in knowing when it is right to stay and when it's right to leave. But here's the big thing. What did they do in the final verse? In verse 7, they continued to preach the gospel. Even though they've had to get out of one city, of one place, because it is dangerous, even though it was right for them to pull out of that situation, they carry on sharing the gospel elsewhere. If we ever have to pull out of a situation for whatever reason, if we ever have to stop sharing the gospel with a family member or friend because it's just no longer appropriate to keep on doing so, or if we've been stopped from going into a community setting where we've been trying to share the gospel, what do we do next if we've been shut down or if we felt we had to get out? Well, we find some other place or some other people that we can share the message of Jesus with or in. Look, division, though it's not desirable, it is inevitable often with the message of Jesus. People either realize the grace and love that is shown in Jesus and accept it, or they resist it. After all, if we are to become a follower of Jesus, well, it is to be humbled, to recognize our deep flaws, and to rely only upon him for our rescue. In that sense, humanly speaking, it's not an attractive message because it requires us to face up to the darkest parts of our souls and to admit that we are completely incapable of bringing light to those dark parts within ourselves. So inevitably, we will face division. We will face times when people hate us and our message and separate from us. And in those times, we will need God's help to guide us for when we need to dig in and for when we need to get out and go elsewhere with the message of Jesus. Well, let's sing a wonderful song, Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. Let's sing.